Is there really a stigma against turn-based RPGs? Do people really think they suck? Or is that just a bunch of hyperbolic nonsense? Let's get into it. Hey friends, it's Just the Gems. I'm Brandon, and you may have seen this story floating around on the internet, okay? One of the creative leads of Clair Obscur, Expedition 33, his name is Guillaume Roche. How do you say that? Guillaume Broche. He's the creative director of Clair Obscur Expedition 33. And in an interview, he said, I'm going to paraphrase him here, but he says that turn-based RPGs fell out of popularity around the Xbox 360 era. And he says it's because open world games were gaining popularity. And so traditional JRPGs just were started to be seen as uncool, I guess. They just started to lose favor among the populace. Hearing that, like it has a ring of truthiness to it, right? You can be like, oh yeah, there were a lot of open world games that started popping up around then. So that makes sense, right? That does track. But I don't know if it actually does. Thinking about it, I wonder if he and people that are thinking like him are maybe mixing up cause and effect a little bit. I mean, obviously we did see a decline in traditional turn-based JRPGs during that era, but is it because there were more open world games that were making JRPGs seem less cool? I don't know about that. Now, it's been pretty well documented, I think, that Japanese developers really struggled with the transition from SD to HD. Microsoft actually really exacerbated this problem too by kind of rushing the Xbox 360 to market. And before Xbox fans come at me and say, how dare I say that they rushed to market, blah, 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 you remember the red ring of death, right? Like a little more quality control on that machine, that wouldn't have been an issue. Like they rushed this thing out because they wanted to beat Sony. They were like, we need to be first in the market. We need to stake our claim right now. And so they rushed this HD console to market, and it led to all sorts of problems for them. A big repair bill on their end, but they did achieve market dominance for quite a long period of time during that generation because they got there first. Unfortunately, this kind of had a ripple effect where all of a sudden HD was everywhere. HD was the new hotness, and Japanese developers were still freaking making games for the PS2, right? They were firmly in the SD world, right? You look at Atlas. Atlas put out Persona 4 on the PlayStation 2 in 2008. The next generation was firmly underway at that point, and one of the biggest JRPG developers was just putting out Persona 4 in 2008. That's bonkers. And from what I understand from reading some interviews with Japanese developers from that time period, it sounds like Western developers had been experimenting with high fidelity for quite a while before the technology was even viable. So they were much more ready for the transition to HD than Japanese developers were. Now, Sony also didn't really help matters by creating the most complicated machine to make a video game for in the PlayStation 3. Freaking Cell processor, man. Like, that thing was nuts to program for. So at the time, Japanese developers, specifically JRPG developers, had kind of two choices, really. Well, three. They could make a game for the PlayStation 3, but that was going to be just outside of the scope of most of those development teams at that point. So they could make games for the underpowered Wii, which was popular, but was kind of becoming the home of shovelware and great first-party Nintendo games, but everything else was just kind of blending together in sort of a Malaise porridge, if you will, of shovelware crap. Or they could make games for the Xbox 360. The problem, maybe you've already identified it, is that the Xbox 360 was not a popular console in Japan. It was, I don't know if it was hated, but like it was not even considered, which maybe is worse than being hated. I think being hated, at least somebody has feelings for you. Being just like disregarded is probably the worst thing, right? That's far worse than being hated. Xbox 360 was just not regarded in Japan. For whatever reason, companies did produce JRPGs, traditional turn-based JRPGs for the Xbox 360, right? We have Mistwalker being probably the most notable of those, giving us Blue Dragon, Lost Odyssey, some like generational bangers, especially Lost Odyssey, right? Like people call that the real Final Fantasy 13. Like big games in that traditional turn-based JRPG arena, but they were on the Xbox 360, which didn't sell in Japan and in the West was primarily owned by people that were not into JRPGs. This was Microsoft's next console. Microsoft's bread and butter was sports games, first-person shooters, things of that nature. It wasn't where the Japanese role-playing fans were gravitating to, right? I didn't have an Xbox 360 until 5 years ago, right? It was just of no interest to me at the time. And it didn't help that I wasn't super media savvy. I wasn't keeping up with video game news at that point in my life, so I wasn't even really aware that Sakaguchi had made games for the Xbox 360. It wasn't until years later that I finally picked them up. So take that, Microsoft being the first player in the HD space, Sony being just way too complicated, way too hard to make games for, and the Wii kind of becoming the home of shovelware and not a true HD console. People wanted HD at the time. These developers, these publishers were like, okay, we need to chase the market trend because I guess things have shifted. And at the time, in particular, the Japanese video game market was in the process of shrinking, right? So they had an even bigger incentive, Japanese publishers, to make games that were targeted to a Western audience. And the, predominant theory was that Western audiences didn't care for that style of game as much, turn-based JRPGs. And I think that their data was based on look at Mistwalker's games, right? They put out these true bangers on the Xbox 360 and hardly anybody bought them because people that bought the Xbox 360 were not the target audience for those kinds of games. They just weren't. Not saying that, people that like JRPGs didn't or couldn't own an Xbox 360, but by and large, that wasn't the group of people that were buying that console. People like me that were super into JRPGs assumed that the next home for JRPGs would be the Sony PlayStation 3. So we saved up our pennies for years and purchased one of those $600 machines. Now, when I talk about the video game market shrinking in Japan, I do want to put in a caveat in case people are commenting or maybe have already commented. The handheld market was kind of a different story. The dedicated handheld market in Japan at that time was still thriving, right? You have the DS and the 3DS, big consoles that got big titles, and there were definitely more traditional JRPGs on those handheld consoles, the PSP, even the Vita to an extent, but I think the PSP is probably where more of the traditional JRPGs ended up. So the handheld market is kind of a different thing. It was big here as well. Obviously, the DS is the second biggest selling console of all time still. So obviously there's a difference there, but I'm talking specifically about the home console market. Another factor that I think sort of influenced publishers away from the traditional turn-based JRPG during this time period is that there was still kind of a stigma around anime, at least in the West, right? And that's, pretty much gone now, right? You have, companies like Delta Airlines integrating Crunchyroll into their in-flight entertainment system. Anime is here now. It is accepted. There are famous people that talk about the anime they love. It would have been unheard of to me when I was younger and really into anime. I mean, I still am, but when I was just discovering anime, it was the nerdiest thing that you could possibly watch. And now it's pretty much mainstream. Japanese developers, Japanese game creators are obviously going to be influenced by the culture around them, the things they grew up with, right? So developers grew up watching anime. They probably still enjoyed anime in their adulthood, and they knew that there was a not insubstantial portion of the Japanese market that was very into those things too. So naturally, there was a lot of anime influence in JRPGs. That just kind of makes sense. That's just what happens in a culture. So that was also kind of a red flag to publishers because they saw this stigma in the West against anime, and they're like, people are not going to want to buy this super anime RPG because, obviously RPGs aren't popular anymore due to, the confusion around the Xbox 360 being the home of these JRPGs, them not selling well, Sony kind of pooping the bed a little bit with the release of their console. So I really don't think it's that JRPGs were suddenly seen as uncool. I think it's various market factors were working against JRPGs in kind of unusual ways. The Microsoft of it all, where they're putting out this HD console before Japanese developers were ready for it. Sony putting out a console a year later than the Xbox 360, a console that is just extraordinarily hard to program for. Like it was kind of a perfect storm that led to JRPGs falling by the wayside for pretty much an entire console generation. It wasn't because our attitudes as gamers had changed. It was the actions of the largest companies sort of just as a byproduct of those actions created the situation where JRPGs, traditional turn-based games, fell by the wayside. I really think that like Microsoft holds the lion's share of the blame for this though. If Mistwalker had made games exclusively for, say, the PlayStation 3, if Lost Odyssey had been a PS3 game, Blue Dragon, if The Last Story, which was a Wii exclusive, if that had been a PS3 game, I feel like the generation would be remembered a lot differently because the audience would have found those games a lot sooner. The core audience that appreciated and has always appreciated turn-based, traditional JRPGs. I know Last Story is an action RPG, but you get my drift, right? Like if these more traditional Japanese role-playing experiences had been directed to the right audience, where the audience was, I think that this generation would not be remembered as like the full decline of JRPGs, particularly in the West. So in my opinion, turn-based JRPGs have never been uncool, or they never like lost favor. Like you can make arguments whether or not they've ever been cool, right? Like nerd culture is obviously big now, but 10, 15 years ago, it definitely wasn't. So there was certainly a time where you could very correctly make the argument that these sorts of games weren't cool, like in the Madden sense or the Call of Duty sense, right? But nowadays, that's obviously changed. Nerds are kings now. It's just the way it is. And I'm very here for that. But JRPGs, and specifically turn-based JRPGs, didn't suddenly lose favor. There were a lot of other factors that were involved in there not being as many JRPGs for us to play at that time. So this resurgence that we're seeing with, Clair Obscur and some of the titles being put out by Square Enix, some of the like Team Asano games and whatnot, like people are scratching their heads and being like, well, I guess turn-based is back. It was never gone. It's just people learned the wrong lessons from that seventh or 8th generation of consoles. They've just completely learned the wrong lessons from that. And that's why we found ourselves in that situation for such a long time. I don't know. That's my opinion on the whole thing. It feels odd to me. Like I never stopped enjoying that kind of game. And the people that I know that enjoy those kinds of games also never stopped enjoying them. So it always felt weird to me that people were like, oh, there was this stigma that suddenly grew up around turn-based games. I just don't buy that. But I'm really curious to hear what you think. Like if you've looked into this at all, if you've thought about it, if you were around for that generation, I would just be really curious to see, to hear your perspective on it, because maybe it's different from mine. Maybe you have some good points to make. Let me know down in the comments. I'd love to read them. Anyway, just wanted to drop in with my thoughts on this because I just feel like it's odd, and I want to determine if there's a consensus. Like if I'm an outlier here and it turns out most people actually do think that they fell out of favor and they're back now, like cool. Either way, I'm glad that they're resurging, right? Like I'm glad that we're seeing more of them, and I hope that continues. I just have always felt like it was odd to think that they fell out of favor for a period of time. I just don't think it's the case. But if you want to prove me wrong, let me know down in the comments. Thanks so much for watching, and until next time, bye.